My name is Luna. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I was known for being steady, the dependable one, the woman who kept things moving quietly, while everyone else chased momentum, attention, or escape. I worked, I loved, I showed up. I didn't make a noise about it. I believed that consistency was its own kind of power. People often mistook that calm for simplicity, or worse, passivity. I was the spouse people described as lucky to have stability, as if stability were something that happened to me instead of something I built every single day. I wasn't dramatic. I wasn't reactive. I didn't need to be seen to feel real. That made it easy for me to be underestimated. This story isn't about rage. It's not about revenge. And it's definitely not about me becoming someone louder or colder to prove a point. It's about perception, how invisibility is often assigned, not chosen. It's about how loyalty can be mistaken for limitation. And it's about what happens when someone quietly stops absorbing what was never meant to be theirs. For years, I stayed inside the structure of a marriage I believed in. I honored it in ways that were invisible but constant. Meanwhile, without my knowledge, another life was being built beyond its walls. This isn't a story of sudden discovery or explosive confrontation. There were no thrown objects, no screaming matches, no cinematic betrayal reveal. Instead, there was accumulation, small absences, subtle shifts, moments that didn't hurt enough to leave, but never healed enough to forget. At the center of it all is a simple truth. I had to learn slowly. I stayed loyal while my spouse built a secret life. And later, when the fog finally cleared, I understood it even more plainly. I lived in the marriage. They lived outside it. What you're about to hear is the emotional journey of realizing that loyalty without awareness can become self-erasure, and that reclaiming yourself doesn't require cruelty, only clarity. I'm telling this story because there are many people who recognize pieces of themselves in silence before they recognize betrayal. People who sense something is off long before they can name it. People who don't want vengeance, they just want their reality back. This is a story about quiet dominance, not the kind that controls others, but the kind that comes from finally choosing not to abandon yourself. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever felt present in a relationship while slowly realizing you were the only one truly living inside it? To the outside world, I was easy to define. I was the spouse who handled logistics, the one who remembered birthdays without reminders, the one who paid bills on time, kept the house functional, and smoothed over rough edges before they ever became problems. People describe me with words like solid, grounded, and low maintenance. They said it as a compliment. I heard it as a role assignment. In our marriage, I became the constant, the background rhythm. If something needed to be done, I did it without announcement. If something felt off, I absorbed it quietly, assuming it would settle if I gave it time. I believed that love didn't need an audience. That commitment was proven in repetition, not performance. My spouse often joked, never cruelly, just lightly, that I was unshakable, that nothing rattled me. Friends would laugh and agree. Luna's the strong one, they'd say. She's got it handled. And I smiled because at the time, I believed that strength meant endurance. What they didn't see was how endurance slowly turned into expectation. I was the one who adapted. If schedules changed, I rearranged mine. If moods shifted, I adjusted my tone. If conversations got uncomfortable, I redirected them toward calm. Not because I was afraid of conflict, but because I valued peace, or at least what I thought peace was. Over time, my presence became assumed. My loyalty became background noise. No one asked how I was doing inside the marriage because nothing appeared to be wrong. I didn't complain. I didn't threaten to leave. I didn't dramatize small hurts to make them visible. So to everyone else, including my spouse, I became proof that everything was fine. But invisibility doesn't arrive all at once. It builds quietly, the way dust settles on furniture no one touches anymore. At gatherings, my spouse would speak about our life in broad strokes, plans, values, stability. I stood beside them, nodding, filling in details when asked. But I noticed something subtle. The stories no longer included me as a presence, only as a function. I was part of the structure, not the narrative. If someone asked how we met, my spouse told the story efficiently, like a summary they'd memorized years ago. No warmth, no pause, no glance in my direction to check if I was smiling too. I told myself it didn't matter, That is not everyone who expresses affection publicly. That intimacy could be private and still be real. And it was real, at least I thought it was. But it was also asymmetrical. I lived inside the marriage. I thought in terms of we. I made decisions based on shared impact. I held space for futures that included both of us, even when only one of us seemed actively present. I believed that loyalty meant staying anchored, even when the other person drifted a little. What I didn't realize then was that drifting isn't always accidental. I was proud of being dependable. I wore it like a quiet badge of honor. I didn't need praise. I didn't need reassurance. Or so I told myself. In reality, I had learned to survive. On internal validation. To measure my worth by how little trouble I caused. How smoothly things ran because I was there. And because I didn't demand attention, none was given. This isn't me rewriting the past to paint myself as a martyr. I made choices. I chose patience. I chose silence. I chose to believe that consistency would be reciprocated naturally. That if I stayed loyal long enough, the balance would hold. But loyalty without visibility creates a dangerous illusion that you will always be there, unchanged, unaffected, unlimited. To them, I was reliable, useful, emotionally self-sufficient. To myself, I was slowly becoming someone who existed in the margins of her own marriage. At the time, I didn't call it neglect. I called it maturity. I didn't know yet that this version of me, the quiet one, the accommodating one, the invisible one, was the only version they believed would ever exist. The first moment didn't announce itself as betrayal. It didn't even feel dramatic enough to remember clearly at the time. That's what makes it dangerous, the way it slid into my life disguised as nothing. It was an evening like many others. We were sitting at the kitchen table, plates half cleared, the light above us slightly too bright. My spouse was scrolling on their phone while I talked about something small, my day, a meeting that had gone well, a thought I'd been carrying. I wasn't asking for praise, just presence. Halfway through my sentence, they smiled at the screen. Not at me, not in response to anything I said, just elsewhere. They murmured, without looking up. I stopped talking, not abruptly, just quietly, like someone stepping out of a room when they realized no one noticed they entered. My spouse didn't register the silence. The conversation ended without a conclusion, like a sentence cut off mid-thought. I remember washing the dishes afterward, telling myself it was nothing. People check their phones, people get distracted. It didn't mean anything, but something about that moment lodged itself in me, not as pain, but as awareness. It was the first small cut, clean, precise, easy to dismiss. Later that week, I mentioned something I was excited about. An upcoming project, a long-term goal. My spouse nodded, distracted again, and said, "That's nice," in the tone people use when they don't intend to follow up. No questions, no curiosity, just closure. I told myself I was being sensitive, that I didn't need to be mirrored to feel valid, that independence was healthy. I'd spent years being proud of how little reassurance I required. But here's the thing about small cuts. They don't bleed enough to demand attention. They just sting long enough to be remembered. Friends were around us often during that period. Dinners, weekends, laughter. From the outside, nothing was wrong. My spouse was attentive in public, affectionate even, a hand on my back. A joke at my expense that everyone laughed at, including me. That was another cut, quieter, sharper. "Luna doesn't mind," my spouse said once, when someone hesitated after a joke went a little too far. "She's chill." I smiled, because I was or because I had learned to be. No one questioned it. Why would they? I didn't protest. I didn't correct the narrative. I didn't say, "Actually, I do mind when you speak for my tolerance instead of asking for it." I told myself it was harmless, that love didn't mean constant sensitivity, that I was lucky not to be easily hurt. But the truth was more complicated. I had trained myself to absorb small dismissals as the price of stability. The first small cut wasn't about disrespect and isolation. It was about noticing that my inner world was no longer being checked for consent. My attention was expected, my patience assumed, my silence is interpreted as agreement. And still I stayed quiet, because nothing had happened. Not really, there was no evidence, no confrontation worth starting, just a faint sense that something had shifted, like standing on a floor that felt solid, but no longer warm. I didn't talk about it. Not to friends, not to family, not even fully to myself. I folded the feeling neatly and placed it somewhere internal, telling myself I'd review it later if it became relevant. I didn't know then that this was how it began. Not with betrayal, but with being gently moved out of the center without being informed. Everyone else ignored it. I remembered it. After the first small cut, nothing exploded. Life continued, which, in a way, made it easier to pretend nothing had changed. The days filled themselves with routines, responsibilities, and shared spaces. From the outside, our marriage looked intact, functional, even enviable. And because nothing obvious was wrong, I learned to reinterpret what I felt until it sounded reasonable. The dismissals became more frequent, but also more subtle. Conversations shortened, not dramatically, just enough that I noticed I was the one still asking questions, still circling back, still offering emotional continuity where gaps had formed. When I spoke about something that mattered to me, the response often arrived slightly late, slightly off-key, like someone clapping a beat behind the music. I adjusted. I told myself my spouse was tired, busy, stressed. I framed their distance as temporary, situational, and forgivable. I had always believed love required context, so I provided it for them, generously, even when they didn't ask. If they forgot something I'd shared, I repeated it calmly, without pointing out the forgetting. If they interrupted me, I paused and let them finish, telling myself it wasn't a competition. If they made a decision without consulting me, I rationalized it as efficiency, not exclusion. Slowly, my boundaries became flexible enough to disappear. What changed most was my internal dialogue. I stopped asking, "Why did that hurt?" and started saying, "It shouldn't." I reframed discomfort as maturity, silence as grace, adaptation as love. Every time something landed wrong, I smoothed it over before it could form a question. And the more I did that, the less anyone noticed anything was missing. My spouse grew comfortable in this version of me, the one who didn't require emotional calibration, the one who could be counted on to stay steady, regardless of imbalance. They began to speak more freely, assume more often, and check in less. Not maliciously, just confidently. That's how normalized disrespect usually enters. Not through cruelty, but through unchecked comfort. There were moments, small, fleeting ones, when I considered speaking up. When I felt the words gather at the back of my throat, I felt dismissed. I need more presence. Something feels uneven, but each time I weighed the cost. Would it create tension? Would it sound needy? Would it make me less easy to be with? I chose quiet instead. Part of me believed that if I could just stay composed long enough, things would recalibrate on their own, that my spouse would notice the shift and correct it without being prompted. I didn't want to manage my own emotional visibility. I wanted it to be mutual. But mutuality requires awareness, and I was slowly removing every signal that something was wrong. So the pattern settled in. I became the emotional constant, the baseline, the one whose needs were assumed to be minimal because they were never voiced. My spouse didn't have to lean in, they could lean away, and I would still be there. And I let them, not because I didn't feel the distance, but because I had convinced myself that feeling it didn't entitle me to disrupt the peace. Looking back, I understand something I couldn't then. By normalizing the small dismissals, I was teaching everyone, including myself, how to treat me. I was reinforcing the idea that my inner life required no tending, that I could carry the imbalance without consequence. This wasn't selflessness, it was self-erasure, practiced quietly enough to feel noble. At the time, I thought I was being patient, understanding, mature. I didn't realize I was also being slowly written out of the emotional equation, by my spouse, yes, but also by my own hand. Roles are rarely announced. They're inferred, reinforced, and eventually expected. By the time I noticed mine, it had already solidified. In our marriage, I had become the stabilizer, the one who made things easier. If there was tension, I diffused it. If there was uncertainty, I clarified it. If there was emotional weight, I carried it quietly so it wouldn't spill into the room. My spouse didn't ask me to do this. They simply learned that I would. And once someone learns that, they stop checking whether you should. I was reliable to the point of predictability. I showed up the same way every time, calm, reasonable, unthreatening. That consistency became my defining trait. Friends would say, "Luna's so easygoing," or "You're lucky she doesn't overreact." My spouse would smile, agreeing. It was never said out loud, but the implication was clear. This is who she is. This is what she's for. I noticed that when decisions were made, about schedules, plans, even future considerations, I was informed, not consulted. Not in a dismissive way, just in a matter-of-fact one. As if my agreement were a given, not something to be earned. And I rarely challenged it. Not because I lacked opinions, I had many, but I had learned that expressing them often led to subtle resistance. Not arguments, just delays, deflections, or the sense that my perspective was inconvenient. So I adapted. I offered input gently, indirectly, in ways that were easy to accept or ignore. Over time, I realized something unsettling. The version of me that was most welcome was the one that required the least adjustment from others. I was useful, emotionally self-regulating, logistically competent, low demand, high output, the kind of partner who made life smoother without asking for equal investment in return. And while that made me valuable, it also made me replaceable in ways I didn't yet understand. Because when someone sees you primarily as a function, they stop seeing you as a presence. I began to feel like a supporting structure, rather than a participant. Necessary, but not central. Appreciated, but not pursued. Trusted, but not prioritized. The marriage ran well because I was maintaining it, but I wasn't being met inside it. Still, I didn't confront it. The role was comfortable in its own way. It came with a sense of moral superiority I didn't name but felt. At least I'm loyal. At least I'm here. At least I'm not the one drifting. That belief kept me anchored even as the emotional center of the marriage shifted further away from me. I told myself this was adulthood. That passion cooled. Those relationships evolved into something quieter, more practical. I compared us to other couples and decided we were doing fine. Better than most, even. But fine is not the same as mutual. And practical is not the same as present. The role I had been assigned, reliable, useful, invisible, wasn't inherently wrong. What made it dangerous was that it left no room for me to change, to need, to be seen differently. I didn't realize yet that while I was fulfilling my role perfectly, my spouse was slowly stepping out of theirs. And because I wasn't looking for what I didn't want to see, I missed the early signs. Not because they were hidden well, but because my role didn't include questioning the structure itself. I was too busy holding it together. The day something shifted didn't come with an argument. There was no confrontation, no raised voice, no moment I could point to and say, that's when everything changed. It was quieter than that, almost disappointingly so. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. I was home earlier than expected, sitting alone in the living room, light coming in through the window at an angle that made dust visible in the air. I remember noticing how still everything felt. Not peaceful, just paused. I had my spouse's tablet in my hands. Not because I was searching for anything. Mine had died, and I needed to check a delivery confirmation. We shared devices casually. There had never been secrecy around passwords or access. Trust, I thought, was intact. A notification appeared, not explicit, not incriminating, just unfamiliar. A name I didn't recognize, a tone I did. The message wasn't romantic, it wasn't sexual. It was easy, familiar, light in a way that had been absent from our conversations for a long time. The kind of ease that comes from emotional availability. From being present. I didn't scroll, I didn't dig, I didn't confront. I just sat there, holding the tablet, feeling something inside me go very still. This wasn't proof of anything, but it was confirmation of something I'd been quietly avoiding. My spouse was showing up somewhere in a way they no longer showed up with me. And in that moment, something inside me recalibrated. Not into anger, not into panic, into clarity. I realized that the question was no longer, is something wrong? It was, how long has this been true? I set the tablet down exactly where I'd found it. I didn't mention the message when my spouse came home. I didn't change my behavior, not outwardly, but internally, a line had been crossed, not by them, but by me. For the first time, I stopped explaining things away. I replayed moments I'd minimized, the distracted conversations, the emotional absence, the way my spouse seemed energized elsewhere and muted at home. I saw how I had participated in my own invisibility by refusing to look directly at what was happening. And instead of confronting them, I did something unexpected. I listened more closely. I paid attention to patterns, to timing, to emotional shifts. I noticed how my spouse protected their phone now, not aggressively, just instinctively. How they laughed more easily at messages than at anything we shared. How their patience with me had thinned, while their tolerance for others seemed endless. Still, I said nothing, because the shift wasn't about catching them. It was about understanding the reality I was living in. I felt grief, yes, but it was a quiet grief. The kind that doesn't collapse you but steadies you. I wasn't losing control, I was gaining perspective. That afternoon, sitting alone in that quiet room, I made an internal decision I didn't fully articulate yet. I would no longer operate on assumption. I would no longer fill in gaps with hope. I would observe before I acted. Silence for the first time wasn't avoidance. It was an intention. After that day, my silence changed shape. Before, it had been instinctive, an automatic smoothing over of discomfort. Now it was deliberate, measured. I didn't announce it. I didn't even fully acknowledge it to myself at first. But I stopped filling in the emotional gaps my spouse left behind. I listened more than I spoke. I observed without reacting. I let conversations end where they naturally fell, instead of rescuing them with effort. When my spouse seemed distracted, I didn't compete for attention. I didn't perform presence to earn presence. And something interesting happened. They mistook my quiet for compliance. Without my usual emotional buffering, small things began to show. Pauses stretched longer. Awkwardness lingered. My spouse seemed unsettled, not because I accused them of anything, but because the familiar dynamic had shifted. I was no longer absorbing the imbalance. Still, I said nothing. I began to notice how often my spouse assumed I would adapt. If plans changed at the last minute, they expected flexibility. If they were unavailable emotionally, they expected patience. And when I didn't immediately provide those things, when I simply responded neutrally, they seemed surprised. Confused even. To them, my silence looked like strength without curiosity, like resilience. They didn't realize it was a restraint. I wasn't withdrawing to punish. I was creating space to see clearly. In that space, patterns became unmistakable. I noticed how my spouse compartmentalized their life, how certain energy was reserved for certain places, certain people. I noticed how they spoke about stress without including me in the solution, how they seemed to live parallel to me rather than with me. And the more I observed, the more I understood. They were no longer emotionally invested in the marriage as a shared reality. They were managing it like a responsibility, while living elsewhere in ways I wasn't meant to see. My silence allowed them to continue. That was the hardest part to accept. Not that they were drifting, but that they felt safe enough to do it openly because they believed I would remain unchanged, that my role was fixed. And for a moment, I let them believe that, not because I was afraid, but because I needed time. Time to understand the full shape of what I was standing inside. Time to ensure that whatever I did next would be rooted in truth, not reaction. Silence became my boundary. I didn't share my thoughts. I didn't seek reassurance. I didn't ask questions I wasn't ready to hear the answers to. I preserved my composure not as armor, but as clarity. To the outside world, nothing changed. To my spouse, I was still reliable, still calm, still there. But internally, I was repositioning. I was no longer the woman waiting for balance to return. I was the woman preparing to act from understanding. And they never noticed the difference. Preparation doesn't always look like movement. Sometimes it looks like stillness with intent. From the outside, my life appeared unchanged. Same routines, same calm demeanor, same quiet presence in shared spaces. My spouse continued to move freely, confident in the narrative they believed was stable, that I was steady, unaffected, endlessly accommodating. What they never noticed was how closely I was paying attention. I began documenting, not in a dramatic way, not with the goal of confrontation. I kept notes for myself, dates, patterns, emotional absences, financial irregularities that had once felt too minor to question. I wasn't hunting for betrayal. I was mapping reality. I noticed how money moved, not vanished, just redirected. Subscriptions I didn't recognize. Small expenses clustered around certain days. I didn't accuse, I simply tracked. Clarity doesn't require permission. I also paid attention to myself. I realized how often I'd been shrinking, lowering expectations, softening needs, editing reactions to maintain equilibrium. So I stopped doing that too, quietly. I let myself feel without immediately neutralizing the emotion. I asked myself honest questions. If nothing changed, could I live like this for another decade? If I confronted this now, would I be acting from fear or from truth? The answers took time. I gave myself that time. I educated myself about finances, about legal structures, about emotional patterns in long-term relationships. Not obsessively, methodically. Knowledge became grounding, not alarming. The more I understood, the less anxious I felt. My spouse, meanwhile, grew more comfortable. My lack of confrontation reinforced their belief that whatever they were doing existed outside my awareness or outside my concern. They didn't realize that my calm was no longer compliance. It was containment. I started making small, invisible adjustments, updating personal documents, organizing records, reclaiming control over things I'd previously shared without thought. These weren't acts of secrecy, they were acts of sovereignty. Emotionally, I shifted too. I stopped centering my spouse in my internal world. Their moods no longer dictated mine. Their distance no longer felt personal, it felt informative. I was learning who they were becoming without me, and that's the part they never noticed. I was no longer trying to be chosen. I wasn't competing with anyone else. I wasn't trying to earn attention. I wasn't waiting to be seen. I was seeing clearly, and that changed everything. There's a kind of power in being underestimated while you're preparing, in being perceived as passive while you're actually precise. My spouse continued to believe I was unchanged because I didn't announce my growth. I didn't need to. I lived in the marriage. They lived outside it. But now I was living with awareness. And awareness, once gained, doesn't fade. By the time I was ready to acknowledge what I knew, I had already positioned myself to act without chaos, without spectacle, without losing myself in the process. They thought nothing was happening. They were wrong. The reveal didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived as confirmation. By the time I understood the full shape of what was happening, I wasn't searching anymore. I already knew where to look, not for evidence to weaponize, but for truth to settle. And when it did, it landed quietly, almost gently. There was no single message that said everything, no photograph, no explicit confession. What emerged instead was a pattern so consistent it no longer required interpretation. Emotional intimacy is being invested elsewhere, time carved out with intention. Resources, emotional, mental, and financial, were allocated beyond the marriage while I maintained its infrastructure. I saw it clearly then. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't confusion, it was a parallel life. And the most sobering part wasn't that it existed, but that it had been built slowly, comfortably, without fear of consequence. Because the version of me my spouse believed in would never look too closely, would never disrupt stability, would never choose herself over continuity. That realization didn't hurt the way betrayal is supposed to. It didn't ignite rage or collapse my sense of self. Instead, it brought a strange calm, like finally naming a sound you'd been hearing in the background for years. I didn't celebrate the clarity. I didn't feel victorious. I felt grounded. This was the private reveal, not the discovery of deception, but the understanding of dynamics. I saw how my loyalty had been used as cover, how my silence had been interpreted as consent, how my presence in the marriage had allowed someone else to live outside it freely. And I saw myself too. I saw how I had confused endurance with virtue, how I had believed being low maintenance made me more lovable, how I had accepted invisibility as the cost of peace. There was grief in that, but it was clean grief, honest grief, the kind that doesn't linger once acknowledged. I didn't confront my spouse, not yet, because confrontation wasn't the point. Understanding was. I asked myself one final, clarifying question. If nothing forced their honesty, would they ever choose it? The answer arrived without drama. No. That answer became my leverage, not over them, but over my own future. I knew then that whatever came next needed to be irreversible. Not impulsive, not emotional, just final in its integrity. I wasn't interested in repairing something that only I had been maintaining. .ng. I wasn't interested in competing with a life built on secrecy. I had lived in the marriage, fully, faithfully. They had lived outside it, intentionally. That knowledge didn't make me bitter. It made me decisive. There is a moment, quiet, almost unremarkable, when knowing becomes final. Not dramatic knowing, not the kind that comes with shaking hands or racing thoughts, but a settled knowing. The kind that doesn't ask follow-up questions. The kind that rearranges your future without asking permission from your past. That was where I stood. Once the truth had clarified itself, I understood something fundamental. I was no longer choosing between staying and leaving. I was choosing between self-abandonment and self-alignment. Everything else was noise. At first, my mind did what minds are trained to do. It laid out options. The first option was confrontation, immediate emotional honesty. Sitting across from my spouse, naming what I knew, watching their face change as the reality landed. I imagined the explanations that would follow, the minimization, the reframing, the promises that would sound sincere because they would be spoken under pressure. I had seen this pattern before, not just in my life, but in others. Crisis creates urgency, not necessarily truth, and urgency has a way of producing performance. If I confronted them now, I would become the center of the problem instead of the quiet witness. The conversation would shift to how I found out, why I didn't speak sooner, and whether I was overreacting. Ng. My clarity would be diluted by debate. I would be negotiating reality. The second option was endurance. I could stay. Many people do. I could accept the parallel life as an unspoken arrangement. I could tell myself that marriages evolve, that emotional fidelity is subjective, that stability is rare and should be protected at all costs. I could continue being the structure while someone else enjoyed the freedom of existing outside it. I knew exactly what that path looked like. It looked like becoming smaller every year. It looked like self-trust eroding quietly. It looked like explaining away my own intuition until it stopped speaking altogether. It looked like surviving but not living. And then there was the third option, the one that didn't announce itself loudly, the one that didn't involve confrontation or endurance, the one that required patience, discipline, and a willingness to accept discomfort without outsourcing it to drama. The option to choose myself fully, privately, irrevocably. This wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about exposing anyone. It wasn't even about justice in the traditional sense. It was about alignment, about refusing to continue living inside a structure that only existed because I was holding it up alone. I realized something crucial in that moment. If I confronted my spouse before I was ready to leave, I would be asking them to decide my future. And I was done doing that. So the decision point wasn't a single dramatic choice. It was a series of internal commitments, made quietly and kept faithfully. I committed to not acting from shock. I committed to not seeking emotional relief through confrontation. I committed to letting clarity mature into action instead of rushing it into conversation. This required restraint, real restraint. Not the self-silencing kind I had practiced before, but a grounded, intentional restraint. The kind that protects your next step instead of suppressing your current feeling. I let myself grieve privately, not the marriage as it was, but the marriage I thought I was in. I mourned the version of myself who believed loyalty alone could secure mutual presence. I allowed that grief to pass through me without turning it into a plea or a threat. And then I asked myself the hardest question of all. If they had never been discovered, would anything have changed? The answer came without hesitation. No. That answer stripped away any lingering obligation I felt to explain, justify, or repair. You don't rebuild a shared home when only one person ever lived there. From that point forward, every choice I made served one purpose, ensuring that when I did speak, my life would already be in motion. I stopped thinking in terms of if. I started thinking in terms of when and what needed to be true by then. I needed emotional steadiness. I needed practical readiness. I needed to know that my decision wasn't reactive but rooted. There is a particular kind of power that comes from knowing you are done before anyone else does. Not a cruel power, a quiet one, the kind that doesn't seek validation because it no longer requires permission. I noticed how differently I moved after that internal decision settled. I was lighter, not because things were easy, but because I was no longer carrying unresolved questions. I wasn't waiting for proof. I wasn't bracing for disappointment. I already had the truth. And that truth didn't demand urgency, it demanded precision. I understood that the moment I confronted my spouse would also be the moment they lost control of the narrative, which meant I had to be absolutely certain that I was no longer dependent on their response, emotionally, financially, or psychologically. This wasn't about outsmarting them. It was about not sabotaging myself. I had spent years being the stable on the patient as one, me, the one who made sure things didn't fall apart. Now, for the first time, that same steadiness was working for me, not against me. I wasn't plotting, I wasn't scheming. I was simply refusing to collapse my future into a single emotional conversation. The decision point passed without announcement. No one felt it shift. No one sensed the finality settling into my bones. But it was done. The marriage, as I had known it, was already over. What remained was logistics, and I was finally prepared to handle those without losing myself. Once the decision settled inside me, something unexpected happened. The noise stopped. Not the noise around me. Life continued exactly as before, but the internal urgency, the pressure to do something, evaporated. Clarity has that effect. When you're no longer debating reality, you don't rush to escape it. You prepare to exit it properly. I didn't change my behavior in any obvious way. That part mattered. I knew that sudden emotional shifts invite questions, negotiations, and explanations. And I wasn't ready to explain anything yet. Not because I was hiding, but because explaining too early would pull me back into the role of managing someone else's emotions. Ns. So I stayed consistent. Same routines, same tone, same presence in shared space. I laughed at the same moments, participated in the same conversations, and responded with the same calm reliability that had always defined me. To my spouse, I was unchanged, predictable, safe. That predictability was my camouflage. Internally, however, every action had weight, purpose, direction. I began by grounding myself in facts, not assumptions, not impressions, facts. I reviewed our financial landscape slowly and carefully, as if I were studying a map before a long journey. I needed to understand where everything stood, not to accuse, not to punish, but to orient myself. You can't move forward if you don't know where you're standing. I noticed how much I had previously trusted structure simply because it existed. Shared accounts, shared responsibilities, shared plans that were never revisited, only assumed to be mutual. I didn't panic when I saw the imbalance. I adjusted my understanding. Knowledge didn't make me anxious, it made me steady. I gathered documents, organized records, updated information that had been untouched for years because it felt permanent. Not out of fear, but out of respect for myself. Permanence should be chosen, not presumed. I asked quiet questions of professionals, neutral ones, hypothetical ones. I listened carefully to answers without reacting emotionally. I didn't make decisions yet. I just learned the landscape. Options lose their power to frighten you once you understand them. At the same time, I made an equally important shift internally. I withdrew my emotional transparency. This wasn't punishment. It wasn't withdrawal meant to provoke curiosity. It was discernment. I realized I had been offering my inner world to someone who no longer lived inside it with me. I had been narrating my thoughts, fears, hopes, and reflections to someone who was emotionally elsewhere. And that wasn't vulnerability, it was leakage. So I stopped. I didn't become cold, I became contained. I processed my thoughts privately, I journaled, I reflected. I allowed emotions to rise and pass without turning them into conversations that would go nowhere. I rebuilt my internal sense of authority. The feeling that I could hold my own experience without needing it mirrored immediately. My spouse didn't notice the shift because they had grown accustomed to receiving without tending. They still assumed my availability, my flexibility, my patience. They still believed I was operating from the same place I always had. And in a way, I was just more precisely. I wasn't plotting, I wasn't rehearsing speeches, I wasn't fantasizing about confrontation. I was aligning my life so that when I did speak, my words wouldn't be carrying the weight of unpreparedness. There is a quiet kind of dignity in moving this way. No theatrics, no countdown, no emotional ultimatums whispered into the dark. Just steady, intentional motion toward a future that no longer required anyone else's permission. What surprised me most during this period was how calm I felt. Not numb, calm, because for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for my spouse to return to the marriage emotionally. I had stopped expecting them to notice the imbalance and correct it. I had accepted that what I was seeing was not a phase, it was a choice. And once you accept that, the path forward clarifies itself. I was no longer reacting to absence. I was preparing for independence. By the time anything became visible, by the time silence gave way to consequence, I needed to be unshakable, not hardened, not closed off, just grounded enough that no reaction from them could pull me back into negotiation. This was not avoidance. This was alignment in progress. And alignment, when done quietly, is often mistaken for nothing happening at all. Consequences rarely arrive with announcements. They don't knock. They don't explain themselves. They simply begin. Subtly at first, almost politely, especially when no one is looking for them. From the outside, my spouse's life appeared unchanged. Their routines continued. Their parallel world remained intact, or so they believed. But beneath that surface, small disruptions had begun to ripple outward, quietly and without my involvement. I noticed it first as their confusion. Not panic, not guilt, confusion. They began asking questions that had never occurred to them before. Practical questions. Slightly delayed questions. Questions that revealed an assumption had quietly failed. Did you already take care of that? Do you know where this is? Have you handled? And for the first time, my answers weren't automatic. Sometimes I had, sometimes I hadn't, and sometimes I simply said no without explanation. No apology, no justification, just a factual response. That alone unsettled them, because my spouse had grown used to an invisible safety net, one that caught things before they ever reached the ground. They didn't know how much of their life had been stabilized by my attention until it was no longer guaranteed. Emotionally, they felt it too. Though they couldn't name it, conversations felt thinner, less buoyant. The easy reassurance they had taken for granted no longer arrived on cue. I was still kind, still calm, still respectful, but I wasn't compensating anymore. And without compensation, the imbalance becomes visible. They began to sense loss without understanding its source. A subtle dissatisfaction crept in. Restlessness, irritation that didn't quite know where to land. They were living in the same structure, but something essential had shifted, and they couldn't figure out why. They didn't connect it to their secret life, not yet. Instead, they searched externally for the discomfort. Work stress, fatigue, circumstances. They tried to correct the feeling without addressing the cause. And the more they did, the more obvious it became that something fundamental was missing. Presence, not mine, I was still there, but the kind of presence that comes from being emotionally met rather than emotionally managed. I watched this unfold without satisfaction. There was no sense of victory in it, just observation. This was the natural outcome of the imbalance no longer being absorbed. For years, I had been the quiet buffer between their choices and their consequences. Now, without confrontation, without accusation, that buffer was gone. And the marriage, already hollowed out by absence, began to echo. My spouse hadn't lost me yet, but they were beginning to feel the cost of having treated my loyalty as infrastructure instead of partnership. And they still didn't know why. By the time my spouse realized something was truly wrong, the window to fix it had already closed. What changed wasn't sudden, it was cumulative. The quiet inconveniences became disruptions. The emotional flatness they'd been skirting around hardened into something they couldn't smooth over anymore. The structure they had relied on without tending began to feel unstable beneath their feet. And for the first time, they noticed me, not with curiosity, with concern. They started reaching out in ways that felt unfamiliar, checking in more often, asking how I was doing, offering gestures that looked like care, but felt rehearsed. It was as if they had finally noticed the absence of something essential and were trying to recreate it from memory. But presence doesn't work that way. I could feel the shift in their energy, a kind of panic, though still muted. They sensed loss but couldn't locate the moment it began. To them, it felt sudden. To me, it felt overdue. They asked questions now, emotional ones. Are you okay? You seem distant. Did I do something? I answered honestly, but briefly. I didn't accuse. I didn't unload years of stored hurt. I didn't hand them a list of grievances to respond to. That phase had passed. Because here's the truth they didn't yet understand. You can't repair a relationship at the moment one person stops believing in its mutuality. What they were feeling wasn't my withdrawal. It was the loss of my investment. They tried to compensate. More time together, more attentiveness, occasional vulnerability that arrived late and left quickly. It wasn't manipulation, it was instinct. The instinct to restore comfort when it's been disrupted. But comfort isn't the same as commitment. I watched them scramble to reestablish balance without addressing the core truth. They had already chosen to live outside the marriage emotionally. And now they wanted the benefits of my loyalty without relinquishing that freedom. That was the moment I knew it was too late. Not because they were as incapable of change, but because any change now would be reactive, not chosen. Motivated by fear of loss, not respect for truth. And I refused to rebuild something that only mattered once it was threatened. I remained calm throughout this period. Not detached. Calm. There was no pleasure in watching someone realize they miscalculated. Only confirmation. They asked if we should talk. I told them we would, when I was ready. That answer unsettled them more than any accusation could have. Because for the first time, the timeline wasn't theirs. They didn't know that while they were trying to fix what they had just noticed, I had already accepted what they had long abandoned. The marriage wasn't ending at that moment. It had already ended, and they were only now arriving at the truth I had been living with quietly for a long time. When the conversation finally happened, it didn't look like what people imagine confrontation to be. There was no raised voice, no trembling hands, no dramatic unveiling of evidence. We were sitting across from each other in a familiar space, the kind of space where years of shared life had unfolded quietly. The atmosphere wasn't tense, it was subdued, as if the truth had already arrived and was simply waiting to be acknowledged. My spouse spoke first. Their words were careful, almost tentative. They talked about distance, about feeling like something had changed, about wanting to reconnect. They avoided specifics, circling the issue as if naming it directly might make it real. I listened without interrupting. When it was my turn, I didn't list offenses. I didn't narrate the past in detail. I didn't ask for explanations I no longer needed. I spoke plainly. I told them that I had been present at the marriage in ways they had not, that I had lived inside it emotionally, mentally, responsibly, while they had chosen to invest parts of themselves elsewhere. I didn't accuse, I stated. They tried to respond with confusion at first, then with partial admissions, then with justifications that arrived too late to matter. Stress, loneliness, misunderstanding. None of it was new. None of it changed the shape of what had already happened. What surprised them most wasn't my words, it was my tone. I wasn't angry, I wasn't pleading, I wasn't trying to win. I was calm in a way that didn't invite negotiation, calm in a way that made it clear I wasn't asking for permission or offering a chance to repair. I told them I wasn't interested in rebuilding something I had carried along. I didn't want to be convinced to stay in a structure that required me to disappear in order to function on. There was a long pause after that. They asked if I was sure, if we could try, if things could change. And for the first time, I didn't soften the truth. I said that change motivated by fear of loss wasn't the same as commitment. I had already made peace with my decision. That this conversation wasn't a beginning, it was a closure. There were no theatrics, no final speech, just clarity delivered without heat. When it ended, we both knew something irreversible had occurred, not because of what was said, but because of what I no longer needed. I didn't feel triumphant when I stood up. I felt finished. After everything ended, there was no dramatic transformation, no sudden reinvention, no need to prove anything to anyone. What came instead was something quieter and far more permanent. Space, not just physical space, but internal space. The kind that opens when you're no longer negotiating your reality or editing yourself to maintain someone else's comfort. For the first time in years, my thoughts moved freely, without circling around another person's mood, absence, or unpredictability. I didn't feel bitter. That surprised people. They expected anger, resentment, a phase of emotional reckoning that would consume me for a while. But bitterness requires ongoing attachment, and I had already let go. What I felt was clarity paired with relief, a steady sense of alignment that didn't fluctuate based on anyone else's behavior. I understand myself differently now. I wasn't low maintenance. I was self-contained. I wasn't invisible. I had been unseen by someone who benefited from not looking. I wasn't too calm, too patient, too forgiving. I had simply outgrown a structure that relied on my silence to survive. My identity no longer revolved around being the stabilizer. I still valued steadiness, but I no longer offered it indiscriminately. I chose where my loyalty went. I chose where my attention lived. I chose relationships that didn't require me to disappear in order to function. What changed most was my relationship with myself. I trusted my perceptions. I listened when something felt off. I no longer rushed to neutralize discomfort or explain it away. I allowed myself to take up emotional space without apology, and I noticed how naturally the right people adjusted. There was no need to rewrite the past with blame. I didn't cast myself as a victim or my spouse as a villain. I simply acknowledged the truth. We were no longer aligned, and I had finally honored that reality. Quiet dominance, I learned, isn't about control. It's about self-possession, and that is who I am now. There's a story we're often taught about loyalty, that if you stay calm enough, patient enough, forgiving enough, love will eventually meet you where you are. That endurance is noble. That silence is strength. That if something feels wrong, it's kinder to smooth it over than to name it. But here's what I learned the long way. Loyalty without awareness doesn't protect a relationship. It protects against imbalance. I stayed loyal while my spouse built a secret life, not because I was weak, but because I believed commitment meant consistency, even in the absence of reciprocity. I lived in the marriage, fully, thoughtfully, faithfully, and because I did, I assumed the other person was living there too. They weren't. And that realization didn't break me, it freed me. The moral of the story isn't leave at the first sign of distance. It's not never trust, and it's not be louder. The moral is simpler and harder. Pay attention to where your presence is being used instead of valued. Notice when your silence is being interpreted as consent. Understand that stability doesn't excuse emotional absence. Quiet dominance isn't revenge. It isn't withholding. It isn't superiority. It's the moment you stop explaining yourself to people who benefit from misunderstanding you. I didn't leave in anger. I didn't leave to prove a point. I left because I refused to continue living inside something that had already been abandoned. And when I did, I didn't lose myself. I found myself. If you're listening to this and recognizing parts of your own life, if you've ever felt steady while slowly becoming invisible, loyal while feeling increasingly alone, know this. You're not imagining it, and you're not required to stay silent forever. Sometimes the most powerful choice you can make is the quiet one, the one that honors truth without turning it into a spectacle. Before we end, I want to ask you something, not to answer here, but to consider or to share if you're ready. Have you ever lived fully inside a relationship, only to realize too late that the other person had already stepped outside it? If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Not for judgment, not for advice, just for honesty. Thank you for listening.